Good morning. Can everybody hear me all right? All right, I get the thumbs up. Thank you very much. My name is Katrin Roth von Zepe-Speler, and I'm the Director of Human Rights and Respectful Workplace here at VIU. And I'm honored to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the Vancouver Island University Arts and Humanities Colloquium. I would like to acknowledge that we are privileged to be meeting here today on the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw people. I would like to welcome our friends and partners from the community and thank you for taking the time to join us in celebrating the arts and humanities. Vancouver Island University greatly appreciates your unwavering support. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our students who are on a journey of discovery and learning. I would also like to extend and welcome faculty and students in the arts and humanities and other disciplines, as well as the members of the university administration. I would like to thank the following very dedicated individuals in the arts and humanities and other disciplines, who comprise the VIU Arts and Humanities Colloquium Planning Committee. And these individuals are Dr. Timothy Lewis, Dr. Daniel Burgoyne, Dr. Deborah Torko, Dr. Katharina Raut, Dr. Helen Brown, and Marion Van de Zon, and Ross Davies. I would also like to thank the individuals and departments across VIU who support the colloquium. The arts and humanities shape our society and build communities. The Dean of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Ross McKay, has said, "The arts cultivate intellectual creativity, autonomy, and a passion for lifelong learning." He has also quoted Marie Baptiste, who uses the Cree term Mawitu Winisewin, which means education for life, to describe the transformative power of education, its ability to create a level of harmony between individuals and their world. The humanities are the study of human culture. The word humanities is derived from the Renaissance Latin expression studia humanitatis, or study of humanitas, which is a classical Latin word meaning, in addition to humanity, culture, refinement, education, and specifically an education befitting a cultivated person. In its usage in the early 15th century, the Studia Humanitatis was a course of studies primarily derived from the study of Latin and Greek classics. At that time, the humanities consisted of grammar, poetry, rhetoric, history, and moral philosophy. Today, the Vancouver Island University Arts and Humanities faculty include the departments of Art and Design, Creative Writing and Journalism, English, First Nation Studies, History, Media Studies, Modern Languages, Music, Theater, and Women's Studies. The humanities are said to aid and encourage self-reflection, a self-reflection that in turn helps develop personal consciousness or an active sense of civic duty. There's an old adage, the pen is mightier than the sword. There's no doubt in my mind that the arts and humanities can evoke political change through insisting on and protecting a person's freedom of expression. I consider myself privileged to have experienced firsthand the powerful role the arts and humanities can play in transforming a country through peaceful revolution. I was born and raised in the German Democratic Republic, better known as East Germany. I lived in Berlin, a city divided by an Iron Curtain and a wall. The East German government would have East German citizens believe that this wall was in place to afford them protection. However, the soldiers guarding the wall pointed their guns at East German citizens. I am very proud to have been part of the movement to stand up for basic civil liberties. I still remember the morning of November 4th, 1989, when 1 million people were chanting, "Wir sind das Volk," in English, "We are the people," as the Russian army prepared to scatter the group with war tanks. The humanities focus on understanding, meaning, and purpose. In 1989, the East German people practiced solidarity, and the community came together to stand united. It was the arts and humanities that carried important messages throughout East Germany and provided the foundation for almost poetic criticism of a dictatorship disguised as a democracy. The Berlin Wall fell peacefully on November 9, 1989. I invite you to keep the arts and humanities in your hearts and in your minds. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Helen Brown, who will introduce this morning's speaker, Dr. Gordon Hack, who will speak about the 1983 Solidarity Movement in British Columbia. Thank you.
So, good morning, everybody. The Colloquium Committee would like to thank the Dean of Arts and Humanities, Dr. Ross McKay, and his office for their financial and moral support for the Colloquium. To begin with, I wondered how many of you were in British Columbia in 1983 and remember Solidarity? Oh, quite a few. Okay, well, for those of you who were there, and for those of you who weren't, in both cases, we're fortunate this morning to have the opportunity to revisit Solidarity with the historian Dr. Gordon Hack. I would like to note that this is Gordon's last semester at VIU as he retires in a few weeks. There's a full complement of historians in the audience today, and we all want to say thank you, Gordon, for being a colleague we've respected and admired for a quarter of a century. Now, to provide a background for Dr. Hack's comments, let me give you some insight into his route as a scholar. Gordon grew up in Prince George, and from there went to the University of Victoria and Guelph University in Ontario for his BA and MA in history. This was the era of what was called New History, or social history. It was a time when historians turned away from writing about politicians and heroic nation building to focus on the lives of ordinary people. This history, with the politics left out, generated enormous energy and excitement at the time, and Gordon was in the thick of the moment. But ultimately for him, the new history did not provide enough answers, nor, indeed, did it ask sufficient questions. Gordon and his wife Joanne returned to British Columbia, where he did his PhD at Simon Fraser University. Here he found his real intellectual home, studying labor history and political economy. Labor history seems a self-evident category, but what is political economy? Political economists are concerned with the interaction of state, capital, and labor. In Gordon's teaching and research, he is always aware of what can be called the constant presence. The constant presence of those three things, state, capital, and labor, and of the need to analyze each of them in regard to whatever specific topic he's researching. This is certainly not common practice for labor historians, who normally take capitalism as a given and keep their focus tightly on labor. Gordon's approach, though, results in a more rounded and complex interpretation of events. Gordon came to VIU's forerunner, Malaspina, in 1989, where he has developed and taught courses in Canadian political history, Canadian labor history, Canadian immigration history, and Canadian history of human rights, as well as in British Columbia history. He's also published many academic articles and 3 books. His first book, Turning Trees into Dollars, and his second, Capital and Labor in the British Columbia Forestry Industry, examine the history of forestry in our province. His new book, and by new I mean really new, The Left in British Columbia, A History of Struggle, covers the period from the 1880s to the 1930s. And I should just add that the book has not yet arrived in Nanaimo bookstores, but if any of you are interested in it, do speak to Gordon before you leave. One of the moments of high drama in the century covered by the Left in British Columbia was the emergence of the Solidarity movement. In fact, the book's cover pictures the Solidarity protest at the legislature. Gordon has argued that the history of the left in BC is not just a discussion of a world gone by. It helps us to understand current predicaments. That same claim can be made for the histories of forestry he has written. In Turning Trees into Dollars, he makes the point that cutting down trees is one thing, but the real magic is turning them into money. In the forestry industry, that magic could involve international capitalization, new government resource legislation, locating national and global markets, developing complicated transportation systems, implementing new industrial, managerial, and labor processes, and negotiating opposition from diverse sources. Now, all of that may sound very familiar to you because those are the kind of issues currently in play in the development of the liquid natural gas industry in British Columbia. History then proves to be something that is oddly about both the past and the present, about then and now. Turning to the subject at hand, Gordon argues in The Left in British Columbia that while the left is not setting the agenda today, it has had an agenda, and that agenda matters. It certainly had one 30 years ago in the fall of 1983. For a discussion of what happened then, it's my pleasure to call on Dr. Gordon Hack.
Thank you very much, Helen. Oops, it's too close. Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you all for being here on this fine, crisp morning and to listen to a talk on British Columbia history. Does it get any better? I'd also like to acknowledge that we are today on Nanaimo traditional territory. I'd also like to thank the organizers in the colloquium committee that put this event together. I've been on the other side of this thing a number of times, attended events, but I didn't realize what a well-oiled machine it was until I got to this side of the podium and participated. And so I'd like to thank the people who I actually dealt with in the committee: Tim Lewis, Daniel Burgoyne, Helen Brown again, Katharina Rout, and Roz Davies. So I'm talking about a solidarity today, and the title is 30 Years On. And typical for historians and anniversaries seem to go together. Every time there's a 10-year anniversary or a 15-year anniversary or a 25-year anniversary of some event, historians crawl out of the woodwork and have something to say about it. Last year, my colleague Tim Lewis talked about the 1972 hockey series. Historians are waiting the 150th anniversary of Confederation in 2017. We're writing our books already, expecting to be called upon. So anniversaries then are important for historians and to get onto the public stage, and they're actually asked questions at these times. And then after the event is over, they disappear into the relative obscurity of the classroom and campus life. For the past years, great number of years, as Helen has suggested, I have been researching and thinking about the left in British Columbia. And then last spring I decided to do this colloquium, and in my Rolodex brain I started to think about anniversaries. What anniversary could I talk about in the history of the left? And the Rolodex went 1893, 1903, 1923, and then I finally got to 1983. So I'd been thinking about this for a long time, and indeed I have published a book on this. Oh, didn't work. I'm glad we're dealing with this now. How come it doesn't work? Techies. There we go. I've published a book on the history of the left, and the Solidarity movement was a part of this. So 30th anniversary of Solidarity, and this is what I am then going to talk about today. And very briefly, just by way of introduction, so people who weren't there, and it's appeared that many of you were, beginning already in 1982, the British Columbia provincial government embarked on a program of restraint. That meant that government was going to cut back on spending, cut back on government operations, and there were cuts to services in the province. That was fine. And then the next year, July 1983, the government went even further. As well as restraint in terms of spending, there were also a series of bills that attacked, among other things, unions, and it made it easier to fire government employees. And at this point in 1983, many in British Columbia thought the government had gone too far. And organizations sprang up to protest what the government had done. And this massive political protest was the Solidarity movement. And it went on through the summer and into the fall of 1983 before abruptly ending on November 13th, 1983. So that's in a nutshell. We're going to get into much more depth in a moment. So, as I contemplated this 30th anniversary, I wondered, beginning last spring, whether the 30th anniversary would be celebrated at all, whether people would talk about solidarity. After all, it was probably the biggest protest in political protest in British Columbia history. It was a massive event. So what would happen? Would it be talked about? And as the summer went on, this past summer and into the fall, there was little, almost no mention of solidarity at all. Nobody was celebrating it. Nobody was discussing it. It was seen as beyond the pale and not important at all. That is until last week, indeed a week ago today, when Jack Monroe died. As many people here probably noted in the news that Jack Monroe, a well-known labor leader in British Columbia, he was head of the International Woodworkers of America, and a very pivotal player in the whole Solidarity affair. So Monroe died, and so I thought, well, what was going to happen here? Would it change the talk at all? Solidarity was always mentioned this past week, if anybody read obituaries, but for the most part, it was treated not as a celebration, but as a problem. Solidarity remains a problem for the left, and indeed the left has not yet come to terms with solidarity in British Columbia. And it seems to me this low profile for solidarity is rather odd, because the left tends to look to the past for inspiration. And for example, this coming June in Cumberland is going to be a labor conference, and people are going to come from Oregon, Washington, as well as parts of British Columbia, and they're going to, I think it's a 2-day meeting, and they're going to discuss Ginger Goodwin, a famous labor leader in British Columbia. There's also going to be much talk about the 1912 to 1914 Vancouver coal mine strike, and so labor then is, and these are going to be seen as inspirational moments in the history of labor. And so these things are typically celebrated in the left. Similarly, many of you may have heard of the Winnipeg General Strike. It wasn't a victory for labor, but still, it's remembered very positively. Workers standing up against government and employers. Some of you may also have heard of the On to Ottawa trek of 1935, where unemployed workers from British Columbia head out, joined by others, to Ottawa to protest unemployment during the Great Depression. Again, this event celebrated. There's books written about it. Indeed, a new book has just come out on it. But Solidarity, 1983, not celebrated. And indeed, at the end of Solidarity, when it ended in November 1983, there was a sense of unease, a sense of queasiness about the whole affair. Many were very unhappy. And indeed, talking to some people before my presentation today, many people are still unhappy about what happened in 1983. Name-calling, recriminations occurred in 1983. Radicals attacked moderates as sellouts. Moderates attacked radicals as being totally out of touch with reality. So it was controversial as it came to an end. In my little chat today, I am going to talk about the controversy at the end and a little bit, but I also want to put the whole solidarity business into a broader historical perspective. And I was wondering, if we look at solidarity beyond what happened at the end, which is what most people think about, if we look more broadly and see it as part of the longer history of the left, is it possible to see it in a more positive light? In the good tradition of historians, I'm going to straddle the fence a little bit. Here, I'm going to see solidarity both as a remarkable achievement, in many ways, a long-standing goal of the left, but as well as a disappointment, something that was short-lived and didn't really lead to anything in future years, despite its promise. Just before I get into a more detailed account of solidarity and some analysis, I just want to note that I am looking at solidarity from the perspective of the left. This is not Christy Clark's interpretation of the solidarity movement. This is not Stephen Harper or Conrad Black's interpretation of the solidarity movement. So it's a debate within the left, and that's what I'm looking at and analyzing today. And I should just note as well, very generally, what I mean when I talk about the left. The left is a very complicated term, and it has different meanings in different places of the world. For me, as I look at British Columbia, I have a very broad perspective on the left. It's very inclusive, and so it includes the union movement. I know not all union members are leftists, but generally in British Columbia, the union movement has been progressive and on the left. Also, my left includes political parties, the New Democratic Party, earlier the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the Communist Party, Socialist parties earlier in the century. So political parties, trade unions, and the left also includes protest movements. Recently, we saw the anti-corporate movement of the 1990s and the Occupy movement of 2011. So these then, in a general sense, are all are part of the left. And so it's a very fuzzy notion of the left, but it seems to me that's the only way we can deal with the left. It's made up of many components, and at certain times, certain parts of the left are more at the fore. So that's the left. So, finally, that's my introduction. Let's do some history. Let's look a little bit more closely at 1983, what happened in 1983. In order to understand solidarity, we have to take a key player. We have to look at the government of the day. And it was the Social Credit Party was in power in 1983. So social credit, and strangely I have to explain what social credit is. Social credit was a party of the right, and it first came to power there you go, big smile. It first came to power in 1952, led by this guy, W.A.C. Bennett, and Bennett was Premier of British Columbia from 1952 until 1972, so a very long time. As I already mentioned, a party of the right, close links to business, and notoriously anti-labor. Bennett defeated, retires, and oddly enough, not oddly perhaps, he is replaced at the helm of social credit by his son, Bill Bennett. So Bill Bennett, not a strong leftist solidarity crowd. There would have been boos normally here if this came up. But anyway, Bill Bennett became leader of the Social Credit Party and becomes Premier of British Columbia in 1975. And indeed, in the early 1980s, Bill Bennett was still Premier. So we've got the Social Credit Party in power. The economic context is also important in the late 1970s, early 1980s. There were serious economic problems, not only in British Columbia, but in the Western world. Inflation was running high. Mortgage rates were skyrocketing. They reached almost 20%. People were losing their houses. Unemployment was in double digits. And government debt was increasing, so the government was going increasingly into debt. It was a very serious time, and it seemed that the various governments in the Western world really didn't have a solution to this. This was not unique to British Columbia, as I said, but Bill Bennett, Premier, decided to act. He decided to do something. He was going to solve this economic problem, or that's the argument he gave. and he initiated something called the restraint program. It first came online in 1982. It was going to curtail government spending, impose limit wage increases for government workers, and things like that. These things were being discussed in other jurisdictions, but Bennett actually brings them in. So 1982, then, the initiation of the restraint program. There's an election in May of 1983, and Bennett wins a majority government. So the people of British Columbia re-elect Bill Bennett in the spring of 1983. And it's at this point that the restraint program becomes more serious, at least from the perspective of the left. There's a budget on July 7th, 1983. The budget continues the restraint program, the cuts in spending, but there are also the famous 26 bills that are associated with his budget in 1983. And these 26 bills are introduced into the legislature, and many of them take dead aim at the public sector unions. There would be layoffs. The government was going to make it much easier to fire workers. Government was going to take greater control over scheduling and things like that. And as I've already mentioned, a great number of workers were going to be terminated, or their jobs were going to be terminated. It wasn't that nasty. I don't know why I'm looking at the Berlin context here. So the number that were going to be laid off at the end of the contract in October 31st, 1983. But there was more to the 26 bills than just an attack on unions. There were also measures that were difficult to justify as cost-saving measures. For one thing, the rentalsman's office was abolished. In British Columbia at this time, there was something called rent control. In order for a landlord to raise rents, they had to go through a process, and they had to justify it. It had been brought in by the NDP government. So, rentalsman office canceled. The Human Rights Commission was done away with. Employers in British Columbia thought this was a little bit too nasty, and so the Human Rights Commission was abolished, and a less stringent Human Rights Act was brought in. Okay, so another thing. Education was centralized, so power was going to be taken away from local school boards and centralized in Victoria. Doctors were going to be given the right to opt out of Medicare. This seemed to suggest that we were going down the road towards privatized medicine. And so what the point is then is this goes beyond just an attack on government unions, but a broader attack on some fundamental things that people thought were important in British Columbia society. Local participation in educating children, the right to reasonable rent, and indeed the positive role of government in protecting women and minorities from discrimination. So, this is the restraint program, and this occurred then in early July 1983. And in response to this, we have the coming of the Solidarity movement. Protest quickly emerged on the left. And in order to understand why this protest emerged quickly on the left, we have to just be a little bit aware of British Columbia culture. The left has a strong tradition in British Columbia. Earlier in the century, there were radical socialists being elected, not this century, the last century. In the early 20th century, socialists were being elected to the legislature in British Columbia, and Nanaimo was particularly prominent in this respect. There were communist parties in the 30s, the Communist Party in the 30s and 40s. The CCF was very prominent in these years, as well as Socialist Party. And also, in 1972, British Columbia actually elected a socialist government. The New Democratic Party became the government of British Columbia. A man named Dave Barrett, seated at center, becomes Premier of British Columbia in 1972. So, political leftist tradition, union movement, also a strong tradition in British Columbia. In the 1950s, British Columbia was the most unionized of all provinces in Canada. Workers were renowned as being militant. And beyond political parties, beyond unions, there was also a tradition of protest in British Columbia that was alive and well in the 1980s. Peace marches, for example, in the 1980s, this is 1980 itself, thousands and thousands of people took to the streets in the early 1980s to protest the nuclear arms race. There was also a more radical left in British Columbia in the early 1980s. The Squamish Five, direct action, right? They used bombs and indeed terrorist actions against property in an attempt to foment social change, economic change. Now, this direct action, the Squamish Five, hardly mainstream left, but still it gives an idea of the range of protest, the range of leftist thought in British Columbia. When people think about decades or eras of protest, they often think about the 1930s, perhaps, or the 1960s, but the 1980s in British Columbia, an extremely turbulent decade. So it's in this context, with a vibrant left, with a long tradition, that the restraint program was brought in. And the left then sprang into action, and it was prodded by a number of groups, and there were coalition groups. There was a group that eventually became known as the Lower Mainland Budget Coalition. So a group of community groups that were protesting the restraint that was in the budget. The BC Federation of Labour, this is the body that represents most of the unions in British Columbia, still does, also began to mobilize. And on the 15th of July, the leader of the BC Federation of Labour, a guy named Art Kuby, was part of the group of people that set up something called Operation Solidarity. Operation Solidarity was the union body that was going to protest against the restraint program, protest against what was in store for government workers, apparently. Notably, many unions that were not members of the BC Federation of Labour, they also joined in. They contributed money to organize this protest. They became part of Operation Solidarity. So we have community groups, the Lower Mainland Budget Coalition, we have the unions, Operation Solidarity, and people were taking to the streets. July 23rd already, 20,000 people protested in Vancouver. 2 days later, 25,000 people protested in Victoria. And in smaller centres across the province and on the mainland and in Vancouver Island, there was also action. So we've got a protest movement then emerging on a number of fronts. There was an attempt then in early August to coordinate this protest, to bring it together, and there were meetings between the Operation Solidarity, the unions, and the Lower Mainland Budget Coalition, which include a great range of community groups. And they set up this thing called the Solidarity Coalition, a loose amalgamation of all these groups, and they were going to try and coordinate what was going on. Again, it was very much a grassroots uprising, a very difficult thing to control, but this organization was going to try and speak for everybody. The first advisory committee was made up of Art Kuby. You see the back of his head here, best shot I could get of him. He was a union leader. Also on the committee, though, interestingly, was Renata Shearer, a former human rights commissioner, and also Father Jim Roberts, a Roman Catholic priest. Now, maybe I'll mention in passing here that at this time, the early 1980s, the Catholic Church, not just in Canada but around the world, had a very radical edge. There was a radical theology, and there were bishops that spoke out in Canada against the economic system. And they actually attacked capitalism, these bishops did, and they said that the economy should put people before profits. Very much irked the Prime Minister of the day, a guy named Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who said that the bishops should leave the economy to experts like economists and politicians. Good. At any rate, so the Catholic Church, very active. It was a militant action. It was very lefty. How left are these guys? And they were drawing on, actually in many cases, Marxist literature. In Poland at this time, too, there was an uprising, as people may be aware, against the domination of the Soviet Union. The Catholic Church had a prominent role in that. The movement in Poland was called Solidarność, and so, that means solidarity. And many in British Columbia felt a kinship, and that was in part helped contribute to choosing the name Solidarity for the movement in British Columbia. So we've got this broad-based movement then by August of 1983. One of the most remembered rallies was on August 10th, 1983. Some 40,000 people attended a meeting at Empire Stadium on Hastings Street in Vancouver. It was a very big meeting, big cheers, lots of speeches, and people who were attended especially remembered when the bus drivers had shut down all the buses in Vancouver, and nobody in the crowd knew that this had happened, and then one of the gates opened into the stadium, and all the bus drivers marched in line, and people will say it was a very moving experience. So solidarity is taking on this life, and it's taking on the sense that people are united against this particular government program. And solidarity also at this time they're not just against things, they're putting together a declaration of values, what they do stand for, and things. And it wasn't revolutionary by any means, but they were talking about the guaranteed Medicare, they were saying, for everybody. They were talking about the guarantee of free collective bargaining. So the solidarity movement was also trying to articulate the society that they would like to see, and they were against what social credit had done. So, protest movement through the summer. We're into September of 1983 now. The 26 bills, had not yet been introduced into the legislature. Nothing had happened yet in the legislature. Then on September 19th, 1983, social credit started to push these measures through the legislature in Victoria. And it's at this point that the NDP was the opposition party, Dave Barrett was the leader of the NDP, they protested. They challenged these bills, they filibustered, they went on and on. At one point, the leader of the NDP, Dave Barrett, was physically ejected from the legislature. He was carried out of the legislature and banned for the rest of the session because of what was called unparliamentary behavior. So the NDP now was into the mix, but social credit had a majority government. They invoked closure, and so the bills did pass, and on October 21st, then, these 26 bills received royal assent. So the bills became acts. They became the law. So we're getting into October of 1983 right now, and this is a big issue. It's front page news across Canada and beyond. October 31st was approaching. This was an important date because the BCGU contract was up then. What was going to happen? They would be in a legal strike position, and there would be these people being fired. They weren't happy, obviously. And the Bennett government, through all this, had not blinked. Right? There was no sense that there was any compromise in the offing at all. From the perspective of solidarity and the union movement, the plan was escalating strikes. We'll send out one group will go on strike, then we'll increase the number of strikes, and more workers will go on strikes. And so this was the plan that was mooted. But as one might guess, there was extreme pressure on the leadership. What to do? Would workers go out? The contract, the collective bargaining problem just had to do with the government workers, the British Columbia Government Employees Union. Would other workers go out? Would the nurses go out? Would the teachers go out? They weren't directly affected, perhaps in the long term. Would the teachers go out? What about the private sector? Would woodworkers, lumbermen, loggers, would electricians, would they put down their tools? Nobody was really sure. And as you move into escalating strikes, you're moving towards a general strike. What would be the economic impact? What would be achieved? So there's immense pressure then on the people running solidarity regarding what to do. Moreover, and overall, to what extent would these workers go out? But they're very important in affecting change. If they quit work, there's going to be immense problems in the province. Would these workers go out to protect or to fight for something in the Human Rights Code? Many wondered. Jack Monroe, as I mentioned, the leader of the International Woodworkers of America, did not believe his workers would go out to support human rights. He said that supporting a strike during the worst recession since the 1930s was not on, just to make sure that sexual preference is written into the Human Rights Code. And again, it shows Jack Monroe's stance at the time, and his particular stance on things. And nobody knew how deeply this resonated among woodworkers or others in the private sector. So that there are decisions, what to do. And there's also, as there always is in British Columbia, there's more radical voices, and they're calling for general strike, general strike, general strike. But then the question was, well, what was the general strike for? Where was it headed? Are you going to topple this duly elected government? What were we negotiating? What did they want to achieve with the general strike? These were all very difficult questions. And unions in October were talking about this, and they were actually holding votes. And some locals would be in favor, other locals were against. There were divisions. The leadership was aware of this. So it was a difficult time on the left and for the unions deciding what to do next. There was also the question of what about broader public support? I've been just looking at the left here, the Solidarity movement. But if we look at the British Columbia population at large, and it's very difficult to get a hold of what public opinion was. These are very fluid events. But probably the social credit government had the support of the majority of the population. Probably if an election had been held, that they would have won the election. There was a general sense, I think, in the population that restraint was necessary, but an agreement that social credit had perhaps gone too far in some areas, but they'd just been elected, give them a chance. Again, very hard to calculate exactly what would have happened, but a sense was that although there was all this enthusiasm on the left, probably overall in the population, not so much support. This takes us into November 1983, and November 1st, wrong one, what's going on here? BCGU goes out on strike then on November 1st, 1983. The plan was now escalating strikes. These guys are in a legal strike position. They go out on strike. 1 week later, the teachers went out in sympathy. And this was a major event when the teachers went out. There was great discussion about whether the teachers would go out. The teachers weren't as militant weren't seen as militant in the 1990s as perhaps they are today. And it was a bit of a surprise that they went out very solidly. There were thoughts that teachers would see themselves more as professionals and they wouldn't link themselves to the union movement. The teachers' movement was also interesting as well because they weren't in a legal strike position. It was a political protest for them. It was much more a nebulous position legally. But still, they did go out. So we have the escalation. Teachers are going out. The city workers were expected to go out next. And there was talk then, would the private sector go out? And so we have this, again, I keep using the word escalating because that's what it was all about. That everything was being ramped up as time passed. And there was great enthusiasm among many people who were participating in solidarity about this, and there was great excitement. Then the whole thing comes crashing to an end on the 13th of November, 1983. And what happens? There's behind-the-scenes bargaining. In other words, secret bargaining between members of union leaders, the BCGEU, the union leaders in BC, and the government. And they're worried about the BCGEU contract, the government workers' contract. And they cut a deal. They cut a deal on Sunday, November 13th, and they're very pleased. It's not a great deal, but they saved the union, they saved collective bargaining rights. They're pretty happy. Government workers are pretty happy. There are some layoffs, but not nearly as many as there were going to be. And it's at this point that the leadership of the union movement, the British Columbia Federation of Labour, decided to call the whole thing off. Let's call the whole thing off. And they came together and they decided to send Jack Monroe to Kelowna. And why they sent him to Kelowna was because Kelowna was the hometown of the Premier Bill Bennett. So secretly, supposedly, Jack Monroe flew to Kelowna. He was representing the BC Federation of Labour, representing the union movement, and he met with Bill Bennett, and they have this meeting, and they decide, they reach a truce. Bennett gets some commitments, or he thinks he gets some commitments from Bennett, but Bennett insists that they not be written down. And in the long run, these are largely ignored. But word sneaks out about this meeting, and reporters get there, and we have Bill Bennett on the left here and Jack Monroe on the right on that famous Sunday. And so the solidarity has come to an end, essentially. The government workers are happy, and the timing is, the word comes out just late Sunday night, just before midnight or around midnight. And that next Monday, there was supposed to be a great number of strikes. Other workers were supposed to go out. These weren't going to happen now. It came to a smashing halt, a conclusion. It was all over. From the perspective of the union movement, this was it. We've gotten a contract. We've gone as far as we could. But for many, this was a very unhappy ending. The community groups looked up and said, what's going on here? What about us? We've been left out. We've been hung out to dry. Nobody's going to fight for us. Human rights people, anti-poverty activists, the people that had struggled in the broader Solidarity Coalition, they felt that they had been let down. They felt betrayed by the union leadership. There was a great sense of unease. There was great anger in the middle of November here in 1983. So that's my brief overview of Solidarity and give you a sense of what it was about. And I just want to stand back and look at it in a broader historical context and try and understand if we can see it both perhaps a little bit in a positive light and in the more negative light that it is usually seen. So look at both sides of the equation, if you will. And as an historian, to see it in a positive light, to see it as in a positive light, as an historian, I get to look at it over a broad span of time. So I get to look at the Solidarity movement. And in a couple of cases, it seems to me that Solidarity was quite a remarkable thing, especially if we look at the history of the left in British Columbia. Solidarity is a big thing. Notion of solidarity is a key concept. Solidarity, unity. This is what the left is all about. Uniting the many against the few, the 99% against the 1%. So solidarity is this key theme in left history. The union movement, for example, the anthem of the union movement, which I've promised people I won't sing, the anthem is Solidarity Forever. Right? Solidarity Forever, this song, the words that were written in 1915 by a union activist. Solidarity Forever encapsulates things. In the left more broadly, there's this call for unity. In the Communist Manifesto, the workers of the world unite. And for social democrats, communists, socialists, the notion of unity, solidarity, important concepts, bringing people together. But if solidarity, unity has been a big goal for those on the left in the last 100 years or so, it has rarely been realized. There's always splits in the left, splits along a number of lines. And I just want to point out a number of these splits in the history of the left to give a sense of how divided it was, and my argument being that it was quite remarkable, the achievement, at least in the summer of 1983, for all these folks to come together in British Columbia. A number of things divided the left. If there was talk about unity and solidarity, well, this unity and solidarity in the late 19th and first half of the 20th century didn't involve workers of Asian descent. There was racism in British Columbia which divided workers. Workers were organizing unions, but they certainly weren't allowing Japanese, Chinese, South Asian workers into their unions. And indeed, workers were participating and keenly trying to keep Asians out of British Columbia, and they were restricting their activities when in British Columbia. This was hardly only unionists that were doing this. Anti-Asian sentiment was spread right through society, but unions and people on the left participated in this. There were also riots at times, and workers were prominent. In 1907, there was a big riot in Vancouver where people charged through town and broke up sections of Chinatown. So disunity then, racism. Another aspect of disunity in the union movement was along skill lines. This may sound like the unions were developed in the 19th century by skilled workers. Carpenters, machinists, later electricians, millwrights, and they had great pride in their work, and they saw themselves as sort of an elite, and they tend to look down on unskilled workers, and they didn't want to have anything to do with them. They didn't want them in their unions, and so there's this division between skilled workers and unskilled workers. Unskilled workers eventually start to organize, especially as factory workers are organized in the 1930s and the 1940s. But the different unions they set up, there's great tension between them. They have two different labor bodies they belong to. And it's not really worked out until the 1950s that they can get together. So it's, again, another split in the left. Another division was between national unions and international unions. Until the middle of the 20th century, most Canadian workers belonged to international unions. And that means, in the Canadian context, unions that had their headquarters in the United States of America. So international unions, the carpenters would belong to a local in Nanaimo, and their brotherhood would be connected to the international, which would have its headquarters in the United States. An undercurrent, a minority of Canadian workers, however, wanted national unions, just Canadian unions. They didn't want their dues to go south of the border. And they would set up competing unions, and they would try and raid the unions of the other side of the internationals, and it was very intense at times. This is one labor body, the All-Canadian Congress of Labor, which existed from 1927 to 1940. But it was an organization that represented national unions, Canadian unions. That's what it was keen on doing. In Nanaimo here in the late 1960s, there was a very dramatic, bitter struggle with the work driven by the workers at Harmac, pulp and paper workers. They wanted to split from their international union and become members of an all-Canadian union called the Pulp and Paper Workers of Canada. Bitter dispute. And this tension between the national unions and the international unions continued into the future. Also, later, another split in the union movement was between public sector unions and private sector unions. In the 1960s and especially the 1970s, public sector workers get the right to organize, but it didn't mean that they were welcome overwhelmingly in the House of Labor. Skilled workers, largely male, tended to see the government workers as service workers. They're mere teachers. We actually do things. We make cars, we cut down trees. And so there was different cultures in the two areas, and the government workers were seen as not working as hard and not doing work that was as important. So there was divisions along that line in the union movement as well. A couple of comments, too, on the left and from the political perspective. People are aware probably, I've already mentioned it actually, that there were left-wing socialist parties 1900 to 1920 in British Columbia. Nanaimo elects socialists to the provincial legislature, which all sounds nice, but there was a great debate in the left politically in the early years of the 1900s. Some wanted to just use the elections to achieve the perfect society. Others said elections were a big sham, that we have to organize people into unions and have a general strike. And these different factions fought with each other. They probably spent as much time fighting with each other as they did fighting for change. Another big political battle on the left was between there's a really big battle. Now you're excited, you know where we're going. Between the Communist Party and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. The Communist Party had a very strong presence in British Columbia, especially the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It did disappear, obviously, but very strong in those decades. And they fought for workers' rights, they fought for union rights, all these sorts of things. And many of the unions in British Columbia were led by communists. In this same era, there was also a socialist party called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. And the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, this is one of the leaders, Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, they also were in favor of unions, wanted social change, wanted more benefits for workers, education for ordinary people, etc., etc. So we've got these two groups, the communists and the socialists. Do they get along? No. They fight like crazy. It's a vicious fight in the 1930s and the 1940s. In the trade unions in the 1940s, the CCF works very hard to expel all the communists. Division, again, being my point. One last point on this division. In the 1970s, as I've mentioned, the NDP was elected. Did this mean harmony on the left? Did this mean peace and harmony? Well, no, it didn't. One of the most critical groups that criticized the NDP during their time in power was the labor movement. The labor movement was angry. They helped elect the NDP in 1972, and they were dismayed because they did not get everything that they wanted. And so there was great concern. There was then division, and indeed many people, I shouldn't say many, but a lot of people say that the NDP lost in 1975 because they didn't have the support of the unions. So the point being in this rather breezy overview that history of the left is a history of division. On a few occasions, people have come together, 1919, for example, sometimes in the 1930s. but mostly it has been division. Playing on the title of the labor anthem, Solidarity Forever, a BC labor historian has perhaps noted more realistically and said, solidarity on occasion, perhaps better describes it. And the summer of 1983 was one of those occasions. The left did mobilize. It did come together. And from a long perspective, a leftist perspective, this could be seen as something worthy of a celebration. So a positive aspect, it seems to me, from a broad historical perspective. From another perspective, I think, too, we can see the Solidarity movement, or people have seen the Solidarity movement in a positive way. Solidarity in British Columbia was not just a protest against the specific policies of the Bennett government. It was part of a fight against a broader trend that was going on around the globe at this time. It was the late 70s, early 1980s, and this is the time of the rise of neoliberalism, the rise of the new right in not in British Columbia, in the world. We had the election of, here we get it finally, we have the election of Margaret Thatcher in Britain, attack on the unions, etc., and government was seen as a bad thing, social programs were seen as a bad thing, and Margaret Thatcher was going to let business do what business does. Similarly, in the United States of America, we had Ronald Reagan. And so then the goal was then to shrink government, get rid of social welfare programs, undermine unions. In Canada, things move more slowly. Brian Mulroney perhaps begins this stage, and the neoliberalism really doesn't come to the fore until we have the formation of the Reform Party in 1987. And this leads to Stephen Harper as Prime Minister of Canada. So a major change was occurring in the world in late 1970s, early 1980s, and Bennett was at the forefront of this. He was part of this rise of neoliberalism, and Solidarity then was standing up not just against the Bennett government, it was standing up against neoliberalism around the world. It wasn't successful, but it was a valiant, though perhaps doomed, a struggle. As one of the negotiators of the BCGEU said, this was the first qualified success on the continent in combating or confronting that Reaganomics Thatcherism ideology that was everywhere at the time. So in a positive sense from the perspective of the left. So there was a coming together then of the left in the summer of 1983, and it also could be seen from the perspective of the left as positive in that it was a struggle against the rising neoliberal tide. But this is not how it's remembered nowadays. Leftists, when they look at Solidarity, focus on the negative side of the equation. They emphasize how fragile that unity in 1983 was. And when you look at the constituent groups in the Solidarity movement, it becomes clear that none of the groups has anything to celebrate. There's nothing that they want to look back on with any pride. And I'll just briefly mention this if we look at these groups. The New Democratic Party. The New Democratic Party does not celebrate Solidarity. Indeed, throughout the whole affair in 1983, they were rather uncomfortable. They didn't like this. The New Democratic Party was a political party, and they want to work through the electoral process. They want to elect people to the legislature and then affect change. They were nervous by these confrontations on the streets. They were nervous about these calls for general strikes. And moreover, the NDP was not running this show. It was community groups and most notably the trade unions. So the NDP was on the sidelines, and they weren't particularly happy with what was going on. They would have preferred people to take it easy. Next election, we'll throw the bums out. That would be the NDP position. And in recent decades, too, as you're probably aware, the NDP has chosen to be seen as a sensible, reasonable alternative, and NDPers do not want to be associated, for the most part, with rather unruly, radical and militant behavior such as the 1980s. Whether or not this is a good tactic or not, I leave to you. So NDP not going to celebrate Solidarity in 1983. Union movement not going to celebrate Solidarity in 1983. Again, they are the ones who decided to end it. They cut it off on that November 13th, 1983. Then there'd be critics ever since about regarding what they have done. Unions often want to say that they speak for workers beyond their members, and so they don't like to be reminded about things like solidarity when they just concentrated on their membership. Community groups, they also have little to celebrate regarding 1983. At the end, at any rate, they were extremely bitter. They hadn't trusted the unions at the outset, but then they'd thrown in their lot with the union movement. And in the end, they were let down. They didn't feel that they had been satisfied. As Frances Wasserlin, a feminist activist of the era, said, the community, the labor movement, it was all so powerful. We were getting stronger every day, and then it was trashed. What a waste. And that summed up the sentiment of many. Still nothing to celebrate. There were no achievements from their perspective. I think a couple of other things with regard to why solidarity isn't remembered. There were no martyrs, and there was no final confrontation. Nobody went to jail. There weren't big court cases. Union leaders didn't go on trial. Nowadays, environmentalists, First Nations activists are willing to take a personal sacrifice, but this didn't happen in 1983. There was no Ginger Goodwin, who seemingly sacrificed his life for the labor movement, a martyr. Goodwin's funeral. This led to a general strike a few days later in Vancouver. There was no clash as there was in Winnipeg in 1919, where police rush in, there were arrests, and there was a major confrontation. The Ottawa trek also had a major confrontation. How does solidarity end? Jack Monroe sneaks into Kelowna in darkness and tries to and meets with Bennett, tail between his legs. Obviously, he's going to Kelowna, so the game's over. Bennett has got him to come onto his turf, and eventually they're caught, as I say. And here we have the famous photograph of Bennett and Monroe, and you can see the look in Monroe's face. He just looks terrified. He's just, as Monroe said, he knew his name would be mud forever. So there were no martyrs. There were no major confrontations. Neither were there great achievements for the radicals in 1983. They may have been calling for a general strike and hoped for a more general uprising, but it was clear they had not been able to muster enough support to take the movement in a different direction. One last comment on solidarity and why it's not talked about much and why it's not perhaps remembered favorably these days. Is that solidarity was not a stepping stone to something greater. In other words, it wasn't a step in the progress of the left. The Winnipeg general strike that I talked about earlier was a defeat for workers. Workers lost in 1919. But thereafter, we got the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, we got collective bargaining rights for workers, Medicare. So it was seen as the beginning, a stepping stone to something greater. Solidarity, on the other hand, was not the stepping stone to something greater. Solidarity was the last gasp to try and hold back a new emerging order, this new conservative neoliberal order. And so solidarity then didn't lead to changes. Indeed, the world we live in now is the world of a much more conservative right. The NDP is moderate. Private sector unions are in trouble. Looks like in the future public sector unions are going to be as well, judging from the way Stephen Harper is talking these days. And so it's a different kind of era. So solidarity didn't lead to progress for the left. It was the last gasp of an era that was ending. So to conclude, a revival of the left in the future, a shift leftward in history, might place solidarity in a different light. Leftists of the future may come to remember or celebrate even the solidarity movement of 1983, seeing it as a mix of values, energy, and optimism that are worthy of inspiration. As it stands, for most on the left, at least judging from what's happened in recent years, the solidarity movement of 1983 is seemingly best forgotten. What the future holds, of course, remains to be seen. Thank you very much.